This is part 2 of our video on A Cross of Gold about the 1896 election. We pick up with the presidency of Grover Cleveland beginning in March of 1893. Within a matter of months of becoming president, taking office in 1893, Cleveland will get hit with the worst economic disaster in this country's history up until the Great Depression. It was a depression called the Panic of 1893, and it lasted for 4 years. It was the worst depression to hit the U.S. up to that time. Businesses went broke by the thousands. Millions of unemployed workers, a lot of suffering in the country. What caused it? Well, the cause was complex. It had a lot of things to do with the European economy and how it affected our economy. But what President Cleveland said caused it was, he said it was actually very simple. He said there's two things responsible for this. He said number one is the Sherman Silver Purchase Act. Number two is the protective tariff. So, you got to be careful offering simple solutions to complex problems, but that's what Cleveland tries to do here. Now, there's something to it. The Sherman Silver Purchase Act provided for the government to buy silver, like we said, and turn it into money, but it's in a de facto gold standard system. What's the U.S. Treasury ready to do with everything it calls a dollar? It's ready to redeem it for gold. So it's tied to the gold standard. It's not going to work. And then when the economy collapses, what do people do with things like gold that they regard as valuable? They hoard it, right? So how could people get gold if they're concerned about the economy? Well, they could redeem it with silver. Here's the problem. The Federal Gold Reserve held $100 million. And if everybody and their grandma went to redeem their silver for gold, there's not going to be enough gold. You see the problem? If the reserve was drained, the people would lose confidence in the U.S. currency. So Cleveland's not exactly wrong about the Sherman Silver Purchase Act. There's just more to it than that. Also, with the tariff, what do tariffs do to prices? They keep them artificially high. Is it a great idea in time of depression to keep prices artificially high? Not really. So again, Cleveland's not entirely wrong. There's just more to it. Cleveland was so anxious to do something, he called Congress into special session in the summer of 1893, and he's really acting like a leader here. This is interesting. In between the time Cleveland called for a special session and the time Congress met, they discovered that he had a really serious cancer on the roof of his mouth. Now, this is 1893. He's going to have a serious operation. They wanted to keep this secret because the economy's collapsing, and if the people find out that the president's got cancer, that's going to cause them to lose more confidence in the economy. Cleveland announced that he was going to take a vacation. He got on the presidential yacht, went out to the ocean a little way, and on a deck chair on the deck of this yacht, his doctors cut the cancer out of the roof of his mouth and replaced it with a piece of vulcanized rubber. Nobody knew this had happened for about 20 years when some historians found out about it. Okay. Now, I call that leadership. Okay. By the time this special session of Congress meets, he's recovered and is back in Washington to be there to kind of influence it. Now, he is able to have the Sherman Silver Purchase Act repealed. Congress repeals that act. But that's going to be politically a disaster for Cleveland. What that does is causes a split in his own party. Okay. You had Northeastern Democrats like Grover Cleveland. He was from New York. But you had a lot of Southern Democrats too, and they're mostly going to be rural. They're going to be from rural areas, farmers, okay? They want more silver, right? So when he repeals the Sherman Silver Purchase, or when Congress repeals it and Cleveland signs that into law, that's going to anger a lot of Southern Democrats and cause a split in his party. Northeastern Democrats are more that part of that industrial base. They're okay with this, okay? To make matters worse, it didn't work. They repealed the Sherman Silver Purchase Act, and it didn't restore any confidence. People kept on redeeming silver for gold. It got so bad that the gold reserve got down to about $66 million. Cleveland was so worried that confidence in the economy was about to be lost that he decided in order to save the gold standard, we needed to sell bonds. We needed to sell gold bonds. In other words, what you're doing when you sell a bond is you're having the people loan money to the federal government for payment later. And the guy they got to sell bonds was the U.S.'s greatest investment banker, J.P. Morgan. Morgan was asked to go out and sell bonds himself, and they would pay him in gold. And the thinking was, if J.P. Morgan goes out and he's telling people buy gold bonds, you're probably thinking, you know what, J.P. Morgan knows how to make money. Maybe I better listen to what he's saying. He made so much money, Congress actually investigated him later. Bottom line here, J.P. Morgan also bought a lot of gold bonds. He basically bailed out the federal government. I don't know if you remember, but about 2008, the federal government had to bail out the car companies in Detroit. 1893, 1894, J.P. Morgan bailed out the federal government. That's how rich this guy was. Now, we had 4 bond issues starting in 1894, sold them for gold. We were able to save the gold standard. Cleveland probably does the right thing here by saving the monetary system of the country, but you're never going to convince the populist of this. He's absolutely hated by them. The bottom line of this is that the country doesn't come out of the Depression. Now, he's not able to get the protective tariff repealed, and that's going to anger Northeastern Democrats to the fact that they even tried to do that. So he's split his party here. So all this is a background to the presidential election of 1896. The populist party is in an uproar. The country's in a depression. The president and his party are blamed. Now, because Cleveland was the president during this panic of 1893, is there really, is there any way the Republicans are going to lose this election? The Democrats get blamed for the depression, so I think the Republicans could have run ahead of lettuce in 1896 and probably got it elected. Instead, they did a little bit better than ahead of lettuce. They went with former governor of Ohio and former Union Army officer William McKinley. McKinley's platform called for the protective tariff and the gold standard. So right off the bat, McKinley comes out and he is appealing to the Northeast. The Republicans are running a very conservative, pro-business, pro-Northeastern platform. Now, when the Democrats had their convention, I believe it was in St. Louis that year, they made a drastic change. In the process, what they did was totally reject Grover Cleveland, totally reject laissez-faireism, and they ran a very pro-Western, pro-Southern, pro-farmer reform platform. In other words, they're going to stand for free silver, breaking up big trusts or big monopolies, stronger regulation of the railroads, and an income tax. None of that stuff is laissez-faire. So this is a complete rejection of Grover Cleveland and laissez-faireism. And in the process of changing and rejecting Cleveland, they're going to find a new leader. And his name is William Jennings Bryan of Nebraska. Bryan was only 36 years old at this time. He's only 1 year over the constitutional limit of 35. Nebraska was a solidly Republican state, so it's kind of ridiculous they thought he might win, but Bryan was a fantastic orator. He had served in Congress 2 terms in Congress in the early 1890s, and he got a reputation for supporting reform issues like free silver and lowering the tariff. Bryan was actually a delegate to the Democratic Convention. And since the party was divided between Northeastern pro-gold Democrats, Southern and Western pro-silver Democrats, they actually had to have a debate to decide which platform the party would follow. And the way they set it up is they would have somebody speak in favor of free silver, then they would have 3 people speak in favor of the gold standard, and then they would have the last person speak in favor of free silver. And Bryan was able to get that final spot. He would be the final speaker to advocate for free silver. His speech was spectacular. We've even given it a name in U.S. history. It goes down as the Cross of Gold speech. Bryan was an intensely religious man. Every speech he gave was sprinkled with allusions to the Bible. And I just want to read you a little bit of his speech. He talks a little bit about the tariff first, and then he switches over to the gold standard issue, and this is the big thing. Quote, "And now, my friends, let me come to the paramount issue. If they ask us why it is that we say more on the money question than we say upon the tariff question, I reply that if protection has slain its thousands, the gold standard has slain its tens of thousands." You get that reference? That's what they said in the Bible about Saul has slain thousands, David his tens of thousands. Bryan does that all the time. Okay, let's go back to it. Quote, if they ask us why we do not embody in our platform all the things that we believe in, we reply that when we have restored the money of the Constitution, all other necessary reforms will be possible, but that until this is done, there is no other reform that can be accomplished. You come to us and tell us that the great cities are in favor of the gold standard. We reply that the great cities rest upon our broad and fertile prairies. Burn down your cities and leave our farms, and your cities will spring up again as if by magic. but destroy our farms and the grass will grow in the streets of every city in the country. So he's making the case here that the farmers are the backbone of America. Then he built up to the big conclusion. Quote, if they dare to come out in the open field and defend the gold standard as a good thing, we will fight them to the uttermost. Having behind us the producing masses of this nation and the world, supported by the commercial interest, the laboring interest, and the toilers everywhere, we will answer their demand for a gold standard by saying to them, you shall not press down upon the brow of labor this crown of thorns. You shall not crucify mankind upon a cross of gold. And that brought down the House. All the delegates went over to the Nebraska sign on the floor of the convention. If you've seen political conventions, you know how they do. Each state delegation will have a sign with the name of the state. Well, all the delegates in the hall ran over to the Nebraska delegation and threw their signs down at their feet, basically saying, hey, your guy's our guy. And that speech put Bryan over the top to win the Democratic nomination. He is running on a reform, pro-farmer, pro-Southern and Western platform. He is different than William McKinley on every single point, okay? So there's a real choice being offered here. A lot of times you have these presidential elections and they might as well be the same guy. But this one's a little different. Now, there's still a third party to consider. We hadn't talked about the populists yet in 1896. Now, Bryan is hoping that the populists will fuse with the Democrats and support him. He's running on a lot of issues that are popular with populists, and he's hoping that they, instead of running an independent candidate, they vote for him. So the populists have a real choice to make. Now, if they fuse with the Democrats, that's the end of the Populist Party. They lose their independence. On the other hand, were they likely to win as an independent third party? Has a third party candidate ever won an election in this country? The answer is no. If Teddy Roosevelt couldn't pull it off in 1912, nobody is. Okay. If you fuse with the Democrats and with Bryan as a populist, you are going to get some things you want. Now, you're not going to get the more radical things like a sub-treasury system or government ownership of railroads, but you're likely to get free silver. You might get an income tax, things like that. Okay. Well, what happened is that most populists decided to fuse with the Democrats. Some didn't. In some states, in Texas, they did run an independent populist candidate, which confused the whole issue because the vice presidential candidate was on two different tickets for two different parties. It was nuts. Anyway, the point is that most populists nationwide decided to fuse with the Democrats and support Bryan because they wanted to win the election. So the fundamental choice you've got here, and it's a big choice. It's business against farmers, more conservative against more reform, or in some cases even radical. One part of the nation against the other, Northeast versus South and West. And it's a real choice. Now, McKinley had about 10 times the amount of money than Bryan did, and he used his money wisely. He actually campaigned from his front porch. He never left his front porch in Ohio. Now, part of the reason was that he said his wife was sick and he really couldn't leave her at home by herself. And that's true. She was sick, had a long illness. But he didn't have to. McKinley used his money to take out print ads in newspapers all over the country. And he took out big ads in these newspapers. He would print posters out and have them hung everywhere around the country, and they all said the same thing. There would be a picture of William McKinley, and then the caption would say, I am the advanced agent of prosperity. Meaning, if you vote for me, we're going to get out of this depression, prosperity is going to come back to the country. Now, Bryan, on the other hand, what's his strength? He's an orator, right? So he travels all over the country. He makes hundreds of speeches. He's exciting. Crowds love him. He's energizing. Here's the problem. Let's say that you live in, Bohunt, Kansas, and William Jennings Bryan comes through one day and he gives this spellbinding stem winder of a speech. And you're all fired up to vote for William Jennings Bryan. And he gets on the train and he rolls off to the next town. And then the next day you're still fired up to vote for Bryan. And the next day. But over the course of the week, you start to forget what he said. Remember, this is before radio. This is before TV. And every day when you walk to town for work, you're seeing posters with a picture of William McKinley on it that say, "I'm the advanced agent of prosperity." When you pick up that newspaper in the morning, you're reading ads for William McKinley saying, "I'm the advanced agent of prosperity." In other words, Bryan's message fades from the memory while McKinley stays in print, okay? Well, McKinley was going to win this election, as you would imagine. Now, it's not a landslide, but it wasn't extremely close either. And if you look at the map, McKinley wins the election in the Northeast and in the West. The Northeast, and that makes sense. That's where all the electoral votes were at the time. Bryan's portion of the country was becoming a smaller and smaller portion of the country. So Bryan doesn't win this. Now, he'll run for president 2 more times and not win either one. He's kind of like the Henry Clay of the 20th century. But let's talk a little bit about the significance of this election. There are significant things to come out of it. For one thing, this kills off the Populist Party. They were likely dead even if Bryan won because they had fused with the Democrats. They fused with the Democrats and lost. They're definitely dead now. And there'll be a populist party that pops up a few years later, but it's not the same thing. This farmers movement never gets that big again. And there's several reasons for that. The fusion with the Democrats. Also, prosperity does return to the country in 1897. I always kind of felt bad for Grover Cleveland. His depression starts almost as soon as he becomes president. It ends almost as soon as he leaves office. And once prosperity returns to the country, nobody thinks about the populists anymore. The Populist Party was built upon a time of need, and now the need was going away. So they kind of die out. Another significant result. Once McKinley gets in and the Republicans control Congress, the United States will go on the official gold standard, the de jure gold standard. They pass a law in 1900 called the Gold Standard Act, and the United States goes on the gold standard and will be there until 1972 when Nixon takes us off. Now, wait a minute, why are we going on the gold standard if there's a shortage of gold? Well, all of a sudden, there were gold strikes in 2 or 3 spots in the world in 1897. You've probably heard about the Klondike gold rush in Alaska. They found gold in South Africa, gold in Australia. I mean, the world supply of gold goes up something like 400% in 4 years. And a lot of that gold made its way here. So we're officially on the gold standard, okay? Another serious thing to consider about this election, would it have made any sense for Bryan to have won this election? What he represents, farmers, rural America, is not what the country is becoming. Now, you can argue whether that's good or bad, but the country at this time is becoming more industrial and urban. And it wouldn't have made any sense for Bryan to win. It made more sense for McKinley to win, and I'm not putting a value judgment on that. I'm just saying McKinley represents more what the country is becoming. And this is what I think is a really big significance of this election. This is the point at which the Democratic Party switches from being a laissez-faire, more conservative-oriented party, Grover Cleveland's party. They switch from that to being a more reform-oriented, more big government party, and they don't ever go back. Okay? This is the point at which the Democrat Party becomes more of the party of a bigger, more robust federal government. Now, the Republicans will waffle. During the early 1900s, you've got a big government Republican Party under Teddy Roosevelt and William Howard Taft. But they'll waffle and go back and forth and go back to being more laissez-faire. You know, you get a president in the 20s like Calvin Coolidge, who's probably the most laissez-faire president we've had since the Civil War. But they'll fluctuate back and forth. The Democrats don't ever go back, okay? So that'll be the end of this one. Hope you enjoyed this episode of History Road Trip, and I look forward to seeing you somewhere down the road. Take care. I hope you enjoyed this edition of Dr. Will's History Road Trip. If you like what I'm doing and want to continue following, please subscribe to my channel and click the notification button so you'll get updates when I post new content. Also, please consider supporting me via PayPal, Venmo, or CashApp. Your support will enable me to go to interesting places and film them and talk about them with you. Feel free to suggest locations that you might like to see me visit in the comments below. Thank you very much, and I'll see you on the road.